Hi, and welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. Our subjects this week, plural, are Isabel and Anne Neville. Isabel and Anne Neville were born in 1451 and 1456, respectively. They were the only two daughters of Richard Neville, the Kingmaker, and his wife, Anne Beauchamp. Much of their childhood was spent at Middleham Castle, one of their father's properties, where they met the two younger sons of the Duke of York, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and George, Duke of Clarence. Spoiler alert, the younger brothers of the future King Edward IV. It is possible that even at this early age, a match between the Earl's daughters and the young dukes was being considered. With the Duke of York's power and Warwick's money, they would be quite the overwhelming alliance. Isabel was just 2 years younger than George, and Anne was 4 years younger than Richard. George and Richard's father was one of the highest-ranking men in England, and Isabel and Anne's father was one of the richest. This would have been an appealing alliance for both families, who were becoming increasingly disillusioned during the reign of King Henry VI. The king was slowly becoming more paranoid. York and Warwick were starting to suspect his advisors, maybe even his French wife, of manipulating the paranoid king. Margaret of Anjou, the Queen of England, was not a fan of the Duke of York. She had already made 2 assassination attempts on York, and this obviously didn't help York to be content with the current ruling family. He wanted major reforms, and he wanted to not be assassinated. When the English Civil War broke out, York and Warwick were on one side, and the king and his allies were on the other side. The Duke of York was killed in battle on the 30th of December, 1460, while fighting in the Wars of the Roses. It was time for Warwick to shift allegiance to the Duke's 18-year-old son, Edward. With Warwick's help, his eldest son became King Edward IV in March 1461. Altogether, Warwick had an annual income from his lands of over £7,000, far more than any other man in the realm, except for the king. These two were cousins and the most politically powerful men in the country. Warwick, the kingmaker, started talking with France to secure a French princess as a wife for the new king. After all, that is exactly what the last King Henry VI had done. At the negotiations with the French, Warwick had intimated that King Edward was interested in a marriage arrangement with the French crown, the intended bride, Bona of Savoy. This marriage was not to be, however, because in September 1464, Edward revealed that he was already secretly married to a commoner, Elizabeth Woodville. The marriage caused great offense to Warwick, not only due to the fact that his plans had been sabotaged, but also the secrecy with which the king had acted. The marriage, contracted on the 1st of May of the same year, was not made public before Warwick pressed Edward on the issue at a council meeting. And in the meanwhile, Warwick had been unknowingly deceiving the French into believing that the king was serious about the marriage proposal. For Edward, the marriage may very well have been a love match, but in the long run, he sought to build the Woodville family into a powerhouse independent of Warwick's influence. The marriage of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville caused Warwick to lose his power and influence. He accused Elizabeth and her mother, Jacquetta of Luxembourg, of witchcraft to try and restore the power that he had lost. He was the kingmaker, and the king he had made was running wild. In addition, the new queen, the unwanted queen, in Warwick's opinion, had a lot of unmarried sisters, and there were only so many powerful noble families he could buy into with a marriage dowry and his 2 daughters. Then, in the spring of 1466, Warwick was sent to the continent to carry out negotiations with the French and the Burgundians. The negotiations centered around a marriage proposal involving Edward's sister Margaret. Warwick increasingly came to favor the French diplomatic connections. Meanwhile, Edward's father-in-law was in favor of a Burgundian alliance. This set up an internal conflict within the English court, which was not alleviated by the fact that Edward had signed a secret treaty in October with Burgundy, while Warwick was forced to carry out sham negotiations with the French. This didn't make Warwick very happy at all, for obvious reasons. He was supposed to be the king's main advisor, and he just kept being sent off on missions that were destined to fail because the king was working against him. This was disrespect from the king that Warwick felt owed a lot to him. Warwick asked the king to marry Warwick's daughter Isabel to Edward's brother George as an act of good faith. Edward refused to contemplate the marriage between Isabel and George, as had likely been the aim of his father, but it became increasingly clear that Warwick's position of dominance at court had been taken over by the Woodvilles. In autumn of 1467, there were rumors that Warwick was now sympathetic to the Lancastrian cause. But even though he refused to come to court and answer the charges, the king accepted his denial in writing. A little sus. Warwick now orchestrated a rebellion in Yorkshire while he was away, led by a Robin of Reedsdale. Part of Warwick's plan was winning over King Edward's younger brother, George Plantagenet, possibly with the prospect of installing him on the throne instead of his brother. The 19-year-old George had shown himself to share many of the abilities of his older brother, but he was also jealous and overambitious. All Warwick would have had to say was, "If your brother's missing, George, you're next in line, so we could make you the king. Oh, and by the way, George, I'll let you marry my oldest daughter, Isabel, so you will also be rich." George had been too young to fight in the Wars of the Roses. He had been sent to his sister in Burgundy for safety. He was looking to prove himself, but he had the misfortune of being an adult in the first time of peace that England had seen in over 130 years. What was an angsty 19-year-old to do to rebel? Well, in July 1469, Warwick and George sailed over to Calais, where George was married to Warwick's daughter, Lady Isabel Neville. The marriage was arranged against the king's wishes by Isabel's father. 17-year-old Isabel was now the wife of 19-year-old Royal Duke George, and a very important part of this alliance. Following their marriage, Clarence joined forces with Warwick. From there, they returned to England, where they gathered men to join the rebellion in the north. Later, Earl Rivers and his son, John Woodville, the father-in-law and brother-in-law of the king, were apprehended by Warwick and later executed without a trial. Some people call that murder. Warwick and George came up victorious, with his army now defeated. King Edward IV was taken under arrest. He was just like, "Here I am, guys, arrest me." There wasn't really a fight put up. He was just like, "Okay, you win, here I am, take me into custody." Warwick then imprisoned the king in Warwick Castle. In August, the king was taken north to Middleham Castle. In the long run, however, it proved impossible to rule without the king. And continuing disorder forced Warwick to release King Edward IV in September of 1469. They did not have the support from the other nobles. They had just enough money for a bigger army, and that's about it. Warwick soon gave up, and once more fled the country with Clarence. They attempted to flee to Calais, but Calais sided with the king, and they were denied entry. Isabel was very pregnant, and while on the ship fleeing England, she went into labor and lost her baby. This baby may have been named Anne, but I only found one mention of that name. I can't help but think that Isabel and her baby are just the innocent victims of all this fighting around them. Isabel was a pregnant teenager whose husband and father kept starting problems. If you listen to our very first episode, this may sound a little like Isabel of France-ish. So, Isabel was aptly named. Denied access to Calais, they sought refuge with King Louis XI of France. Louis arranged a reconciliation between Warwick and Margaret of Anjou, the wife of the former King of England. And as part of this agreement, Margaret and Henry's son, Edward, Prince of Wales, would marry Warwick's youngest daughter, Anne. Anne was only 13 or 14 at the time, and her groom, Prince Edward, was 17. I don't know a lot about Edward's personality, but what I do know is that at 7, his mother was letting him choose how traitors were killed. At 7, he was like, I think they should lose their heads. And his mother, Margaret, was all, good job, baby, making that decision. I can't. He was 7. The objective of the alliance was now to restore Henry VI to the throne. If this plan was successful, Anne would be the Princess of Wales and future Queen of England. If it failed, they would be at best exiles, and at worst, prisoners or dead. Again, Warwick staged an uprising in the north, and with the king away, he and Clarence landed in England in September 1470. After Isabel, Neville's sister Anne, was married to Edward, Prince of Wales, the son and heir of Henry VI, George rejoined his brother, realizing that he was now unlikely to become king. Letters from King Edward were taken to Clarence by an unnamed lady who came to visit Isabel. Inside these letters were promises of reconciliation from the king if Clarence abandoned the cause of Warwick and the Lancastrians and rejoined his brother the king. Clarence replied that he would rejoin his brother Edward as soon as was conveniently possible. He was playing it cool, like, yeah, cool, we can be friends, I'll get there when I get there. Warwick restored Henry VI to the throne in October 1470. Edward had to flee this time with his wife and children seeking sanctuary. George and Isabel were yet again on the losing side. If I'm Isabel, I'm starting to question my husband's judgment. It would be nice if just once George was on the winning side of an argument. He got another chance when his brother, whom he now supported, Edward IV, returned to the country in March 1471 and quickly recaptured London and the person of King Henry VI. And I just can't with the ease with which these men capture each other. It's like they're playing tag, but with armies. The mentally unwell Henry VI was taken by Edward IV as prisoner to the Battle of Barnet, where Warwick was killed on the 14th of April, 1471. Fog and poor visibility on the field led to confusion, and the Lancastrian army ended up attacking its own men. In the face of defeat, Warwick attempted to escape the field, but was struck off his horse and then killed. Edward IV then incarcerated Henry VI in the Tower of London. Meanwhile, Anne was with her new husband and new mother-in-law, Margaret of Anjou. She has an episode of her own, so check that out if you need a refresher. They likely would have known that Anne's father had just died, and they were about to battle. This battle would decide who was the king, King Henry VI or King Edward IV. It was King Edward IV. At Tewkesbury, Anne's husband Edward was killed. She was now apprehended, along with Margaret of Anjou. They were in a dangerous position. They were the two highest-ranking women of the losing side. And everyone would have to wait to make sure Anne wasn't pregnant with the heir to the Lancastrian throne. Pregnancy tests were not easily accessible at the time. Following the decisive Yorkist victory at the Battle of Tewkesbury on the 4th of May, Henry was reported to have died of pure displeasure and melancholy, although rumors that Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was responsible for his death, maybe by strangulation or smothering in his sleep, were more likely. It wasn't necessarily at his hands, but it's more believable that he had him ordered killed, as opposed to him dying of pure melancholy. I'm sure Anne was pleased to find out that she wasn't going to be a teen mom. As the wife of a traitor to the crown, Anne wasn't free to leave, though. But she did live in a castle, so it was an okay house arrest. I'm torn, because the person put in charge of Anne was Isabel's husband, George. Would it be annoying if a judge says your brother-in-law is legally in charge of you 100%? Yes. But also, as far as jail goes, I'd totally pick hanging out with my sister in a castle than prison. But the main problem for Anne was that this likely could be her life forever. If Anne never got remarried, George would, as custodian of both of Warwick's daughters, get all of his money. And as we discussed, he was a very, very rich man. Age-old story, we've talked about it before. Rich men with only 2 daughters. I'm annoyed for these women. There was some discussion about Anne marrying Richard, the king's other brother. George thought no, likely because he didn't want to share the inheritance with his brother. He went so far as to hide Lady Anne in a kitchen as a kitchen maid, so his brother couldn't find her. Rude. Richard, who managed to find Lady Anne, even dressed as a kitchen maid, thought yes. He may have wanted Warwick's money, or he may have had genuine affection for Lady Anne. They had known each other since they were children. The king sided with Richard, and Anne and Richard were married. The Neville sisters were now married to the York brothers. Their sister-in-law was Elizabeth Woodville. If you need a refresher on her, she has her own episode too. Back to Isabel and Anne. Although their mother was still living, the husbands of the 2 Neville sisters fought over the inheritance that they couldn't get until their mother-in-law was dead. George was not happy about the marriage of his brother and his sister-in-law, but grudgingly accepted it. The exact wedding date of Anne Neville and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, is not known, although most sources agree that the ceremony took place sometime in late spring, early summer of 1472, after a dispensation to marry was issued from the Pope. This dispensed the impediment of affinity created when Anne married Edward of Lancaster, who was related to Richard. Basically, you can't marry your distant cousin's wife, unless the Pope is like, nah, you're good, bro, go for it. And he did. The couple made their marital home in the familiar surroundings of Middleham Castle, where they had grown up together. Upon their marriage, Anne was styled Duchess of Gloucester. Their mother, the Countess, was still alive. She was technically the owner of the substantial Beauchamp estates because her husband had left no male heirs. Richard agreed to a prenuptial contract in the following terms. The marriage of the Duke of Gloucester with Anne, before named, was to take place, and he was to have such and so much of the Earl's land as should be agreed upon between them through the mediation of arbiters, while all the rest were to remain in the position of the Duke of Clarence. In short, George and Richard would figure out how Anne's money, lands, and titles would be divided. Women need not worry about the law. Richard and Anne, at Middleham Castle, governed the northern England for his brother. He was warden of the north, basically. They had only one child, Edward, born at Middleham, allegedly sometime in 1472 or in 1476. We don't know. It was one of the two. Anne's mother, the Countess of Warwick, joined her daughter's household in 1473, after Richard obtained the king's permission to release his mother-in-law from her guarded sanctuary where she had been since the death of her husband. George lost some of the property he held under royal grant and made no secret of his displeasure. King Edward planned to put both of his younger brothers in their place. In 1473, Isabel and George had their second baby and the first one to survive, Margaret. She does not yet, but will have her own episode. In 1474, to settle the dispute once and for all, Anne was declared legally dead by Parliament. She wasn't dead. She was just declared legally dead. She was a fully alive woman. And her inheritance was divided between her 2 daughters because she was dead, except that she wasn't, just legally dead. How rude. Rude. I can't even. So the inheritance was divided between her 2 daughters, or more aptly, their husbands, the York brothers, The woman was not dead. In 1475, Isabel had another child, this time a boy named Edward. The very next year, in 1476, Isabel had another baby, this one named Richard. They seem to be going for the Edward, Richard, George trifecta that runs in their family. All three brothers attempted it. None of them succeeded it. Isabel Neville died on the 22nd of December, 1476, 2.5 months after the birth of Richard. It is thought now that the cause of her death was either consumption, or you may know it as tuberculosis, or childbed fever. Yet at the time, her husband accused one of her ladies-in-waiting of having murdered her, and committed, in turn, a notorious judicial murder of that lady. It was like, you're guilty. So, I mean, it was legal, but really rude and probably not even a little bit true. George was entering his paranoid era, where he had been for some time. In 1477, Clarence was a suitor for the hand of Mary, who had just become the Duchess of Burgundy. Edward objected to the match, and Clarence left court angry at his brother. George's mental state, never stable, deteriorated from that point and led to his involvement in yet another rebellion against his brother Edward. But George, the always on the wrong side guy, lost that fight as usual. Clarence was imprisoned in the Tower of London and put on trial for treason against his brother, King Edward IV. He had been accused of plotting the king's death with black magic. Clarence was not present at his trial. Edward himself prosecuted his brother, declaring that he was guilty of unnatural and loathy treasons. Following his conviction, he was privately executed at the Tower. Soon after the event, a rumor spread that he had been drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, his favorite drink. But this may have just been a bad joke played by his brother, the king. Isabel and George's children were wealthy, orphaned wards of the crown at the ages of 5 and 3. They were put in the custody of their Aunt Anne and Uncle Richard. For 5 years, Anne and Richard, along with their son Edward and their niece and nephew, Margaret and Edward was the name of the king at the time, and very popular. Edwards everywhere. Everywhere you look, more Edwards. On the 9th of April, 1483, Edward IV died at the age of only 40. Anne's husband Richard was named Lord Protector for his 12-year-old nephew, Edward V. The king is dead. Long live the king. Anne's husband Richard sent men out to collect the new 12-year-old king. The 12-year-old king was with his mother's family. There was a clash over who had legal custody of the new king. Kids shouldn't be kings, guys. I just can't. The king's uncle and half-brother were apprehended and killed. The king's mother, Dowager Queen Elizabeth, ran a sanctuary with her daughters and her other son. Richard asked the queen to please send her other son to help him keep his brother company in the Tower. He's so lonely. Being in the Tower wouldn't have been alarming. There were royal apartments there, and it would be a common place to house a child king there for safety until everything was worked out. One of two things happened. What probably happened is that Queen Elizabeth agreed, probably hoping that her cooperation would buy some goodwill from her brother-in-law. The other thing that could have happened is she could have sneaked him away and sent a random child to the Tower. It was probably the former, but we'll get back into that when we get into Perkin Warbeck. Both of her sons were probably now with their Uncle Richard, and all of her girls were with her in sanctuary. But on the 25th of June, 1483, Edward V and his siblings were declared illegitimate, and Richard ascended the throne as King Richard III. This is why he's always the bad guy. He imprisoned his nephews, then declared them bastards so he could be king instead. This is why people don't like you, Richard. Stop it. By declaring all of Edward's children illegitimate, he was free to be king. Though by their own laws, it really should have been George's son, and after him, his sister Margaret, and only then would it be Richard. But George had been bad, and his children had been disinherited. It was a whole thing. I don't know. They were just kind of playing by their own rules. Anne Neville was crowned alongside her husband. The Queen's train was borne by Margaret Beaufort, who has her own episode. Margaret's son would later defeat Anne's husband in the Battle of Bosworth Field in just 2 short years. The reign of Richard III only lasted 2 years. Almost the entire peerage of England was present at what was a magnificent spectacle. Richard and Anne's son, Edward of Middleham, was created Prince of Wales in York Minster on the 8th of September, 1483, following their royal progress across England. Despite her loss of her sons, Elizabeth agreed to let some of her daughters go to court. It may be that she had just given up the fight. Her sons had gone missing since they had been in the Tower, and she had lost her husband. She wouldn't have wanted her daughters to have to stay in sanctuary forever. But she was also a plotting woman, so I assume it has something to do with that. She may not have had an army anymore, but she did have books and cleverness. Anne was on good terms with her mother-in-law, Cecily Neville, Duchess of York, with whom she discussed religion. Anne and Richard's son, Edward, died suddenly in April 1484 at Middleham Castle, while his parents were in Nottingham on their way to visit him. Both Richard and Anne were overwhelmed with grief at this news. Anne was particularly heartbroken at losing her only child, and there were rumors about King Richard and his niece Elizabeth. There were rumors that he wanted to replace the old queen. The old queen was 28, by the way. She was not old, but the old queen with his young niece, who was 19. Anne fell gravely ill only a few months later. Anne Neville died on the 16th of March, 1485, probably of tuberculosis, like her sister. But for my conspiracy people, maybe she was poisoned. The day she died, there was an eclipse, which some took to be an omen of her husband's fall from heavenly grace. But he was, by this point, a very unpopular man. Richard III is said to have wept at her funeral. Nevertheless, rumors circulated that Richard III had poisoned her in order to marry his niece, Elizabeth of York. Richard sent Elizabeth away from court and publicly rebutted these rumors during an assembly of lords he had summoned to the Hospital of St. John. Addressing them in a loud and distinct voice, he showed grief and displeasure aforesaid, and said that it never came into his thought or mind to marry in such a manner wise, nor willing nor glad of the death of the queen, but as sorry and in heart as heavy as a man might be. There's no reason to doubt Richard's grief over his wife's death. It seemed genuine. And I like to think they were in love, because so few were back then. Anne and Isabel's mother Anne outlived her husband and both of her daughters. She died in obscurity and was survived by her 2 grandchildren, 19-year-old Margaret and her brother, 17-year-old Edward, both of whom will return in future episodes. And that is where we will leave it for this week. What did you think of Isabel and Anne Neville? It feels like a story we've heard before, the wealthy heiress tale. Feels like these women got carried away in the Cousins' War and had not much to say in their own lives along the way. And their mother being declared legally dead while she was still alive? It just can't with the York brothers. They were a lot. Shakespeare was pandering to the Tudors, and that's why Richard III is seen as a villain in Shakespeare. But that's kind of like blaming editing. He gave them all the ammunition to take out his reputation. His brother, I think, would have been pretty disappointed with the way he acted as regent. Just having the royal children declared illegitimate. You can share your thoughts with me at longlivethequeenpodcast@gmail.com or on Facebook or Instagram at Long Live the Queen Podcast. Long live to all the queens out there. And until next week, bye.